Some of you know that I have a bunch of, we could call them dead mentors. So people from past centuries who have spoken into my life, whose writings, whose lives have kind of inspired me and encouraged me. And one of those dead mentors is a guy named Charles Spurgeon, and I know I've referenced him before. Charles Spurgeon was a pastor in London, England in the latter half of the 19th century. He's generally considered to be one of the greatest preachers of all time, and you maybe didn't know that they have rankings like that, but apparently they do, because Spurgeon's always there at the top of the list. And his conversion story is kind of interesting. So he was the son and the grandson of pastors. So he grew up really knowing Christian faith, generally speaking. He actually, when he was a little kid, he stumbled upon Pilgrim's Progress, this old classic Christian book, in his grandfather's attic, which is a good thing for kids to stumble upon, if only that was the case for every kid. So he stumbles upon this, he reads it over and over again, he's enthralled, enraptured by this, but he doesn't really know salvation. He kind of knows about it, but he doesn't know it personally. He hasn't experienced it, and he's longing for that. And so when he's 15 years old, Spurgeon is just heavy burdened with guilt, with sin, and is desperate to know how he can be saved. And so he decides that he is going to visit every single church in his hometown of Colchester. And so every Sunday he's going to a different church hoping to hear the word of salvation. One Sunday morning in January, it's a brutal day. It's bitterly cold. The snow is falling. The wind is howling. And Spurgeon's still 15 years old. He sets out. He's going to church. And he's aiming to go to a particular church, but the weather's just so bad that he pulls off into this little church called the Primitive Methodist Church. I don't think church names like that would fly anymore today. The Primitive Methodist Church. It walks in, it's just this tiny place. He had actually heard bad things about it. He had heard that they sang so loud and aggressive in this church that you would leave with a headache. Not that that's ever been critiqued of any modern church ever since, of course. But he goes into this church. It's like 15, 20 people, a tiny little building. He just sits down and he bows his head because he just feels so burdened. And when the time for the sermon came, I'm gonna just read you straight from Spurgeon's words in terms of what happened. He says, "The minister did not come that morning. He was snowed up, I suppose, and at last a very thin-looking man, a shoemaker or tailor or something of that sort, went up into the pulpit to preach. Now, it is well that preachers should be instructed, but this man was really stupid." And if you have a problem with that, then talk to Spurgeon in eternity. It's not your issue, it's not with me. He was obliged to stick to his text for the simple reason that he had little else to say. The text was, "Look unto me and be ye saved, all the ends of the earth." And that was from Isaiah 45. He didn't even pronounce the words right, but that didn't matter. The preacher began thus. It says, "Look. Now look and don't take a deal of pains. It ain't lifting your foot or your finger, it's just look. Well, a man needn't go to college to learn to look. You may be the biggest fool, and yet you can look. A man needn't be worth 1,000 a year to be able to look. Anyone can look. Even a child can look. But then the text says, "Look unto me. I," said he in broad Essex, which I'm not going to attempt. "Many of ye are looking to yourselves, but it's no use looking there. Look to Christ." And Spurgeon says he just went on like this for 10 minutes. He didn't really say anything else. He just said, "Look to Jesus," over and over again. And finally, the old layman, this uneducated man, looks at Spurgeon, looks directly at him, and he says, "You, young man, look very miserable." Can you imagine if I did this in a sermon? You look very miserable, and you'll always be miserable, this man said, as long as you don't obey this text. Look to Christ. Look. And Spurgeon says that was the moment of salvation. That was when, for him, everything clicked. And he realized what it meant to believe in Jesus, to receive salvation. It meant looking away from himself and looking to Jesus. And that really, we could say, that changed the world. This man's sermon, uneducated, unsophisticated, inarticulate sermon, 10 minutes long, repeating one idea over and over again, this changed the world because Spurgeon came to faith in that moment and went on to inspire thousands and millions even. This morning, I don't know where you're coming from. I don't know what the state of your heart or your soul is this morning. Some of you probably feel burdened and weighed down like Spurgeon did. You feel weighed down by the guilt of sin. You feel weighed down by the anxiety of this world. And I will say to you, look to Jesus. Some of you are coming here this morning and you're saying, Pastor, tell me 5 easy steps to be happy, to be successful. Give me some practical things that I can do this week. And that's all well and good, and there's a place for that. But before any of that, I would just want to say, look to Jesus. And some of you will say, Pastor, give me a vision. Show me a vision for my life, for this church. Give me a set of values, a mission statement, a vision statement, that kind of thing. And again, there's a place for that, and that's all well and good. But before we talk about that, let's have a compelling vision of Jesus. Let's look to Him. Let's look at Him. And that's what we've been doing for the last year and a bit here at the Bridge Church. We've been going through the Gospel of Mark, and just over and over and over again, we're looking to Jesus. And that's what we're going to do again this morning. We're getting towards the end of the book. We're getting close to the crucifixion. And so this morning we're in this narrative about Jesus' arrest and His trial. And what we're going to do is we're just going to look at Jesus. Look at who He is in this text, His experience, His identity, His mission. And we're going to do that in kind of 5 parts. So if you've got your Bibles, you can open them up to Mark chapter 14. We're starting in verse 43. And again, we'll kind of break this into 5 parts. So Mark 14:43. Just as Jesus was speaking, so this is right after the Garden of Gethsemane. We were there last week. Just as Jesus was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. And with him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Rabbi, and he kissed him. And the men seized Jesus and arrested him. And then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Am I leading a rebellion, said Jesus, that you've come with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. We could say that in this first episode of this narrative, we see Jesus the threat. I've always wondered, why did they need Judas? Why did they have to pay Judas, these leaders of Israel? Why couldn't they have just arrested Jesus like Jesus says, he was teaching every day in the temple courts. Why couldn't they have arrested him there? Well, it's because Jesus was a threat. Because Jesus was so immensely popular with the people. They loved him. They hung on his every word. They would say things like, Jesus actually teaches with authority, unlike all our other teachers. Jesus was immensely popular, and so they knew that if they ever came and arrested Jesus in the sight of others, that it would cause an uproar. It would cause a riot. It would cause an outright revolt on the part of the people. And so they had to do this secretly. And they go to Judas, and Judas knows that they're going to be in the Garden of Gethsemane. The Gospel of Luke tells us that this was a customary place for Jesus and the disciples. So Judas knew this is where he's going to be. This is where you can get him. And he leads the people there. They had to arrest him secretly to avoid that riot, to avoid their own status in the eyes of the people being compromised. They had to do this secretly because Jesus was a threat to their power and to their status. I have to say, Jesus really is a threat. They were right about that. If Jesus has His will be done, if His way were to actually hold sway in our world, then all kinds of things would come crumbling apart. All kinds of things would fall down. The whole entertainment industry would suffer immeasurably if the way of Jesus actually held sway. The whole military-industrial complex that pumps so much money into our economies, that would suffer incredibly if Jesus' way actually held sway. There wouldn't be so much need to build things that kill other human beings. In so many ways, Jesus is a risk, is a threat. You think about, some of you will know the story in the book of Acts in the early church, where in Ephesus, the gospel is being preached, and all of a sudden people are burning all their magic texts, and they're doing away with their idols, and all of a sudden there's this countermeasure by the authorities in Ephesus, because their economy is being threatened by the gospel. No more idolatry, no more magic, that's trouble. Jesus is a threat. And he's not only a threat to cultures and economies, he's a threat to you individually. Because if his way holds sway in your heart, he is going to ask you to die to all kinds of things that you have held on to, things that you have valued and treasured. He's going to start renovating parts of your life that you didn't even know needed fixing. He's going to ask you to die to your pride and to your need for wealth and your need for comfort. He might all of a sudden ask you to leave everything you've got and go off to some other place to serve him. Jesus is a threat, individually and culturally. They weren't wrong about that. Now, the difference, of course, or the key thing, is that in all the ways Jesus is a threat, he's actually a threat to bring about abundant eternal life. He's a threat to actually bring us into a greater degree of wholeness. That's the threat. So in one way, the leaders of Israel underestimate the threat of Jesus, but in another way, they overestimate the threat. Because they come not just to arrest him secretly, but they come with a huge group of armed men. And the Gospel of John especially uses imagery, uses technical terms that indicate this group is hundreds of people strong, maybe even thousands of people. But let's go hundreds of people armed with swords and with clubs to arrest Jesus. They think that Jesus and his Galilean fishermen are worthy of that kind of force. Now, why is that? Well, it's because they assume that Jesus is going to be like every other earthly leader. Every other leader of a movement is bound to react to this kind of thing with force, with violence. Jesus is going to cause his followers, call his people to rise up and fight against that. That's what they assume, because that's the way of the world. And to be fair, one of Jesus' disciples seems to think the same thing. He takes out his sword and lops off a guy's ear. Gospel of John says that guy was actually Peter. Peter's been following Jesus for 3 years. He should know that this is not the way of Jesus, but he's so convinced that the way of the world, the way of the sword, is the way of Jesus, that he takes out his sword and performs a little amputation. I mean, Jesus looks at this and he says, enough. I am not that kind of ruler. I'm not leading that kind of movement. I'm not leading a rebellion. You see, they overestimated the threat of Jesus. Jesus was not there to impose himself on others, to bring about a military, violent kind of revolution. That's not what Jesus was about. And I look at the history of the church, and I see that very often the church has not been a threat in the way that Jesus is, and has been a threat in the way that Jesus isn't. So often the church has, in its life, individually as Christians, in our lives, we have just parroted our culture. We have just maintained the status quo. We haven't been a threat in that way, but we've been a threat through trying to impose our ways, our thoughts, our beliefs on other people. So through the Crusades or through Christendom. I was at a quote-unquote Christian event earlier, or last year, I guess it was, and the person who was speaking, the person who was leading it said, this isn't word for word, but they said something like, hey, our culture isn't afraid to say bad things about the church, and it should be. We need to show our culture our strength. We need to get our people together, show them our numbers, show them our power. And I'm like, where did we get that from? How did we get to that from this? How do we get to that from Jesus? We've been a threat in the ways that Jesus isn't, and we haven't been a threat in the ways Jesus is. And the way Jesus is a threat is by humbly, faithfully following the Lord, even if it's counter everything else in our culture. And if we're going to follow Jesus, that's the way we need to be a threat as well, not the other way. So Jesus the threat. Let's go on. Verses 50 to 52, we see Jesus the abandoned. Verse 50, then everyone deserted him and fled. And a young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus, and when they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. This is an interesting little story, isn't it? It's been called the first recorded instance of a streaker in history. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what someone has said. Mark is the only one to actually include this story, which has given rise to the popular suggestion that this young man is actually Mark. That Mark this is his byline, his anonymous signature, his little cameo appearance in his own gospel, which may be the case. But what's interesting, despite that, or aside from that speculation, is to look at this term for young man. Very often, when this term is used in Jewish literature, it describes a young, valiant warrior, a courageous, strong young man. That's often what it refers to. And so here's this strong, valiant young man wanting to follow Jesus, but fleeing the scene. And this actually fulfills, or at least is very similar to an Old Testament passage. Amos 2:16 says, even the bravest warriors will flee naked on that day, declares the Lord. Even the bravest warriors. You see, I think what Mark is saying here, first of all, is that when push comes to shove, everyone is capable of abandoning Jesus. Everyone is capable of this kind of treachery. Everyone is capable of this kind of unfaithfulness. And this goes back to something we talked about last week. We talked about how one of the marks of being spiritually awake is humility, is recognizing our vulnerability. Because when we think that we're immune to failure, that's actually where we are the most vulnerable to failure. Discipleship means coming to Jesus over and over and over again and saying, yeah, this can be me. I'm capable of this. I need your strength. I need your power. And maybe that's actually why Mark leaves this person nameless, not because it might be him, but because it might be any of us. Any of us could be part of this story, fleeing Jesus no matter how strong or courageous we are. But the second thing I see in this is that even when everyone abandons Jesus, even when everybody gives up on him, that he doesn't give up on them. He doesn't come to this place and go, okay, that's it. Everybody's left me. Everybody's fled. I'm done with this. I'm not carrying through with this anymore. These people aren't worth my death and resurrection. They're not worth my salvation. I'm just going to abandon this whole thing. Even here, where Jesus is abandoned and everyone, all his closest people, flee him in the moment of crisis, even there, Jesus is faithful. Even there, he continues on this journey, this path to crucifixion. He is faithful, he is merciful, he is patient. He just keeps going even when all have abandoned him. Is Jesus abandoned? Yes, but even in that, he is creating a people for himself. Let's keep going. Let's look at Jesus the accused. Starting verse 53, they took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the teachers of the law came together. And Peter followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest. And there he sat with the guard and warmed himself at the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they didn't find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. And then some stood up and they gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another not made with hands. Yet even then, their testimony did not agree. And then the high priest stood, am I going to that? Yes. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. We get a little bit of insight here, kind of, into first century Jewish legal proceedings. And I say kind of because actually on almost every count, the Sanhedrin contradicts their own rules and traditions. So, for example, this collection of teachings by Jewish rabbis called the Mishnah says that if the Sanhedrin is trying a capital case where someone's life is on the line, that you need to do it in 2 sittings, and both of those sittings of the Sanhedrin, the ruling council, both of them need to be during the day, and neither of them can be on the evening of a Passover or of a festival or of the Sabbath. So here they are, they're trying Jesus in the middle of the night on the evening of the Passover, not exactly in line with their own traditions. The Sanhedrin warns witnesses against rumor or hearsay. And this, of course, is deeply rooted in the Old Testament that says, for example, passage in Deuteronomy that says anyone who falsely witnesses against somebody in a capital case, that their own lives, that's the cost of it. That they are to be put to death if they're trying to get other people put to death by falsely witnessing. That's the cost. And here, the Sanhedrin parades these people up there, these false witnesses, and there's no consequence. Apparently, there's no cost for these guys to do this. The Sanhedrin also says that the charge of blasphemy can only be directed against somebody if they have directly cursed God. And while Jesus says a lot of things, some pretty extreme things here, he does not directly curse God. So over and over and over again, in other ways too, you see that this Jewish ruling council is breaking every rule in their own books to get Jesus killed. And some people look at that and they say, well, Mark must have been making this up then. He didn't really understand. He didn't really know what the traditions were. But that's not the case. What is happening here is that they are so consumed with killing Jesus, they're willing to break every rule. You've seen this in legal dramas, in TV shows, in movies, where some corrupt lawyer is willing to tamper with the evidence and tamper with the witnesses and do everything possible to get this person declared guilty. That's what they're doing here. The only charge that even has a ring of truth to it, even an ounce of truth to it, is this claim that Jesus said he would destroy the temple and rebuild it. Now, Jesus never actually said that. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus does say that the temple is going to be destroyed. He doesn't say he's going to do it, but that it's going to happen. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says, destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. But John is clear there that Jesus is talking about his own body. His body is the temple that will be destroyed and in 3 days be rebuilt. The resurrection is what John's talking about. So even this charge that had a little bit of truth to it, not really. And what I see here is that all of these accusations against Jesus are not actually based on any kind of objective truth. They're not actually based on rational logic. They're all based on this emotional, visceral reaction towards Jesus and the threat that he represents. It's not based on truth. It's based on this emotional reaction. Now, throughout history, people have put Jesus in the witness stand, haven't they? In every culture, among every people, Jesus gets put on the witness stand. You've probably put him on the witness stand as well. Everyone around you has. We put him there and we throw accusations at him. We say, Jesus, you're not actually who you say you are. You're not actually God. You're not actually a Savior. You're not actually who you said you were. You didn't actually do what you said you did. You haven't fulfilled your promises in my own life. Over and over again, in every culture, these accusations get thrown at Jesus. And I would say the same thing that we see here in the Sanhedrin very often. Those accusations are not actually based on rational, logical, purely objective thinking as people would have you believe, but very often it's based on some kind of deeply seated emotional reaction towards Jesus or especially towards his people. I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of people in all of our lives who would say, I want nothing to do with Christianity. And they're not saying that because they've actually thought through the claims that Jesus has made. They say it because maybe they had a bad experience with church at some point. Some Christian said or did something that really rubbed them the wrong way, that was hypocritical. They were in some church where things really went off the rails. They had a parent or some other authority figure who claimed to be a Christian and yet mistreated them. Whatever it was, it caused this emotional reaction. And people present it as something different, but that's what it is. And the incredible thing to me here is that Jesus, the victim of all these false accusations, stands there and he takes it. He stands there and he's silent. They throw one thing after the next, all this junk, and he's just silent. And this is consistent with what we read in the Old Testament. So in Isaiah 53, Isaiah sees the servant of the Lord who is going to suffer on behalf of the people. And Isaiah says he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. This is the character of Jesus, that even when we throw these accusations at him, that he's patient and that he loves us, and somehow he takes it. But that's not the end of the story. See, what we see in the New Testament is that Jesus ultimately is not the guy who gets thrown into the witness stand. He actually is the judge. So in Acts 10, Peter says that Jesus commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that he is the one whom God appointed as judge of the living and the dead. Jesus is the judge. We accuse him, we throw him in the witness stand, but in the end, he is the judge. He is the one that we are going to be held accountable to. He's the one who's going to judge us based on our response to him. We throw him in the witness stand, but he is the judge. Jesus the accused, yeah, but he's a lot more than that. Let's keep going. Verse 61b. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." And then the high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You've heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" Why do we need any more witnesses? Jesus has implicated himself. He has shown us that he's guilty by his own words. We don't even need these false witnesses. All we need is Jesus' words. They ask him if he's the Messiah, and we've talked about this before. The Messiah was this end-time king who was promised, who would come and who would restore Israel, who would save and redeem Israel. And they're looking at Jesus right now. And Jesus has been abandoned. He's been arrested. He's been hauled before court. I mean, he, with the people who he came to save, has been disgraced in front of those people. There was no conception that that's what would happen to the Messiah. That's not what the Messiah looks like to them. It's so obvious that this isn't the case. I want you to imagine that you're walking along and you encounter like a panhandler on the street. Somebody who's just wearing, rags. Just clothes are tattered. They smell terribly. Perhaps they're even strung out on drugs. And they come up to you and they say, "I am the Prime Minister of Canada." Or they say to you, "I am, the Canada's envoy to the United Nations," or "I am the CEO of a Fortune 500 company." What would you think? Would you believe that person? Heck no. You wouldn't believe them? I mean, look at where they are. Look at their state right now. Of course they're not like the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. You would dismiss this as the ravings of a crazy person, somebody out of touch with reality. But what if that person somehow had the charisma to actually persuade other people to believe him? What if he actually had a movement of people who also believed that he was the rightful Prime Minister of Canada and that this movement was growing? I mean, now it's still unbelievable, it's still crazy, but now it's dangerous. Now it's not just some innocent, harmless fantasy. Now it's actually got legs, and it needs to be stopped. It needs to be put down before things get out of hand. And if you put yourself in that situation, then you understand the Sanhedrin with Jesus. So they know that they know that Jesus believes this about himself. They've heard him say things like, essentially, "I am the Son of God." They've heard Jesus say things like that. So they know what the answer to this question is. Jesus here finally, he affirms that. He breaks his silence and he says, I am. Now, that might just be a kind of a coincidence. These two words might not mean anything more than just two simple English words, I am. But this is also God's self-revelation to Moses in the book of Exodus. So Moses is saying to God, look, you want me to lead your people out of Egypt, you got to tell me who you are, tell me your name. And God's answer is, I am who I am. And in the Greek version of the Old Testament, the words are ego eimi. And here in Mark, Jesus' words are ego eimi, I am. There might be something there. And that case is strengthened by what comes after. Jesus mostly he quotes from a couple passages, but the main one is from Daniel chapter 7. And in Daniel chapter 7, the prophet Daniel, this is back in the Old Testament, the prophet Daniel has this vision. And in this vision, he sees the Ancient of Days, God Almighty, all-powerful. And he sees someone like the Son of Man. So this is somebody who is human and yet mysteriously more than human, who approaches the Ancient of Days and receives a kingdom that has no end, and then receives the worship of the nations. Again, a mere human being does not receive an eternal kingdom and is not worthy of worship, especially not from a monotheistic Jewish point of view. And yet the Son of Man is somehow much more than human, receives worship, receives this kingdom. And Jesus says, that's me. That's who I am. I'm the Messiah. But I'm a lot more than that actually too. Now again, to the religious leaders, the Sanhedrin, that just doesn't compute. That they already thought they had him dead to rights on the Messiah thing. Now Jesus goes over and above that. So let's read the finale of this story, of this narrative. They all condemned him as worthy of death. And then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him. They struck him with their fists and said, prophesy. And the guards took him and beat him. This is just the beginning of Jesus experiencing disgrace. In these last few sections of Mark, it's just one way after the next that Jesus is humiliated. He's abandoned by his closest friends, betrayed by them. He's mocked, taunted, hit, spit on. Everything that humanity has to throw at Jesus gets thrown at him in these last hours. This section is just the beginning of Jesus being plunged further and further and further down into the depths of the human experience. And what we need to understand is that Jesus chose to walk this path. It was not forced upon him. Jesus had multiple opportunities to go a different way. We talked about that last week in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus could have just kept on walking, could have gone into the wilderness, could have left this whole thing behind, but he keeps going forward. He is committed to this. He enters into this weakness, into this vulnerability, not from a position of weakness actually, but from a position of strength. He chooses this. Why? Why would anybody choose this? Well, it's because Jesus didn't come to save the mostly saved. He didn't come to get people who are at a 9 over to a 10. He didn't come just to get the people who are kind of nice and have their lives together, to get them into the kingdom. Jesus came so that everyone who puts their faith in him could be saved. He came so that the people who are most lost in the darkness, most consumed with futility, the people who are at the depths, who are in the deepest of pits, even those people could be saved. Jesus came into the deepest of darkness, into the lowest of pits to pull those people out. Jesus came because nobody would be beyond the scope of his redemption. He had to go this far down so that nobody could be beyond the scope of his redemption. So this morning I want to say, look to Jesus. And when we look to Jesus, often we look to him in his glory. We look to him in his resurrection. We look to him as the king over all things. We look to him as the one who was and who is to come, the one through whom all things were made, the one who holds all of creation together, the one who works miracles and powerful signs and wonders. We look to him in all of that, and we should. But this morning, I want to say, look to him here as well. Look to him as the one who is deemed a threat, the one who is abandoned, the one who is falsely accused, the one who is mocked for being the Messiah, the one who is disgraced. Look to him here and know that he went there willingly for you and for me, so that none of us would be beyond the scope of his redemption. I want to conclude with one more thought. Let's go back to the streaker. So this man is wearing this linen garment. And when he flees, they hold on to the garment. He goes free, but they've got the garment. The word for that garment is a rare word. Mark uses it only in two contexts. So one is here. It's the word sindon, just this linen garment. And it becomes a symbol of this man's shame, doesn't it? I mean, he flees naked. That's a shameful thing. And they're holding this linen garment. That's a symbol of his disgrace. That's a physical representation of it. The only other context that Mark uses this word, sindon, for a linen garment is in Mark 15, after Jesus has died. And they take his body down from the cross, and this guy named Joseph takes the body and he wraps it in a linen garment. And it's the same word, sindon. Jesus is wrapped, you could say, in the symbol of our disgrace, in the representation of our shame. Jesus takes that upon himself. He takes our place in that shame. The shame of our nakedness, the shame of our sinfulness, of our betrayal, of our abandonment. He takes that on himself. Jesus is laid in the tomb. And 3 days later, he's not there anymore, but the garments are. You see, Jesus takes our shame upon himself, and then he leaves it there in the tomb. And so this morning, again, I want to say, look to Jesus. Look to him who took your shame and your disgrace upon himself and left it behind in the tomb. Look to him and come with him into life.